Hello and welcome to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is the second in a series of lectures on behavior skills training, Chapter 12E, and we're going to be talking about behavior skills and the specifics of behavior skills in addition to watching some videos as well. So, I just want to remind you of the four basic procedures that are involved in basic skills training. We include modeling and imitation, very explicit instructions that go along with that modeling and imitation, repeated rehearsal, and instructor feedback. And so those are the four big components. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to have you go watch a few examples of basic skills training. I'd like you've already watched the lecture video on BST training for fire safety and one for self-dressing. And if you haven't done that yet, please pause the video and go to the assignments folder and go to lecture videos for this unit and watch those two videos before you continue the PowerPoint for Chapter 12E. Okay. So I briefly want to, those examples kind of, I think, really help cement what BST looks like. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the more detailed issues related to basic skills training. And one of them that I want to talk about is something called in situ assessment. And in situ literally means in the situation or at the site. It's Latin for at the site. And this is assessment where you go in and you run your assessment after training is completed to establish the probability that the individual will use the trained skills in the appropriate location, in situ. And so what you're really doing is placing the individual in a circumstance where the trained behaviors would be appropriate and testing whether or not they will spontaneously use the skills that you have trained. This is typically done without the learner's knowledge. So if you're working with children or with people with disabilities, the parents or caregivers would help to set up this situation so that you can see whether or not they would engage in the behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about a paper by MIiltenberger and some of his colleagues. And actually there's a comma missing, and I'm going to put it in right there. Sorry about that. Hello. Thank you. All right. So let me talk about the Gator Ridge, MIiltenberger, Hunick, Satterland, Mattern, Johnson, and Fleschner paper from 2004. And it's a gun safety paper, so it's related to his TED Talk. So this was training gun safety and doing gun safety assessment with 6- and 7-year-olds. And he was able to demonstrate using BST that children were trained what to do when they encounter a gun. And the children were able to correctly repeat the instructions, and they were able to correctly demonstrate the appropriate behavior. So from all intents and purposes, during training, the children had mastered all of the steps associated with gun safety. However, during the in situ assessment, when they were placed in a setting where they came into a room and a gun was present, the children failed to comply by using the correct procedures. In fact, some of them ignored the gun, others actually picked up the gun and handled the gun. Clearly they had learned, the researchers had demonstrated that the children had learned what was appropriate during training, but they failed to use those skills during this assessment period. And the one difference was that during training there was an adult present, and during the testing, during the assessment, there was no adult present. And so they were able to determine that the problem was that the adult or adults who had been present during training had become the discriminative stimulus for the behavior occurring. And so the presence of an adult is what prompted them to use the correct behavior. In other words, the children's behavior fell into two categories. When an adult is present, I have to do the behaviors correctly. But when there's no adult around, I can do whatever I want. And so that was a huge problem. So one of the things that really helps when you are training important behaviors like fire safety and gun safety and abduction safety, it's a really good idea to do generalization training by putting them in the situation, doing your training in situ. Repeat the training in locations where it's appropriate that the skill might be needed. Try training without a researcher present. Often an in situ assessment will begin, and if the child fails, a teacher will step in immediately and retrain the behavior and try to make it clear that they need to do it in the absence of the teacher. Generalization training with different people present, with no people present in several different locations, all of those components can help ensure that the behavior will occur when you most need it. The standard situation is when you do an in situ assessment, if the child does not perform the correct behavior, the trainer enters that location and changes the in situ assessment into a training session and then conducts later assessments after they get opportunities to rehearse in that appropriate setting. All right, just a few comments. First of all, group BST. You can use behavior skills training on groups. The modeling can occur to the entire group, the instructions can occur to the whole group, and then you can break into small groups and allow individual rehearsal and if you have you might need a small group of trainers, one to go with each group. I did some BST training with a graduate student, Andrew Arellano, and we used peers as co-trainers. And so the children trained each other, older children trained younger children, and using BST, they were training them how to seek help when lost in a grocery store. And so in an applied situation, you could go to an auditorium at an elementary school and train the 4th or 5th graders how to engage in the behavior that you want to train, and then use them as co-trainers when you train kindergartners. So it seems like there's room for turning BST, which often feels very individualized, into a more group-based form of training, which then can be useful for entire classrooms of 20 or 22 kids. The advantages of doing BST in groups is that it's very efficient. Learners gain experience by watching their peers. They're able to actually give each other feedback, and in the process of giving feedback about what they did correctly and what their peer did incorrectly, they're actually cementing their own knowledge of what is required. It can also provide some degree of generalization training by having them engage with different people and different, maybe in different settings. They do it in the class, or they do it in the auditorium, and then they might get a chance to practice later out on the playground. And it also allows for children to get praise from more people. So that's a typo. I'll fix that instead of stopping my video. So they're able to get praise and reinforcement from people other than just the trainer, which can be very useful. So when you're training, when you're planning to use BST as a training system to work with an individual or with a group of individuals, the first thing you need to do is a task analysis. And I'll be having you do a task analysis in class as a kind of a homework assignment, and then we'll talk about them in class, where you're going to break those behaviors down into individual steps. You want to identify all of the stimuli that are going to serve as prompts for the desired behavior and make sure that you draw attention to them when you're training. You're going to assess the learner's existing skills by establishing a baseline first. So you want to ask the kids or give them the opportunity to demonstrate what their knowledge is in the situation so that you can show improvement. You want to train the easiest skills first. If you have a really long, complex chain, you either want to go from the beginning and train from the beginning and then add pieces, or you may want to train the easiest behaviors first and then embed them in more difficult skills. And then finally, you want to describe and model first so that you can set up the context. That's a huge piece of what you need to do. Remember that you need to ask the learner to repeat back the rules. They should be able to tell you what is supposed to happen, and they should be able to provide feedback, corrective feedback, and praise to each other based on knowing what the rules are for the appropriate steps in the behavior. You want to have lots of rehearsal opportunities with feedback and praise, and you want to repeat that until you see mastery. And then, if possible, you want to engage in generalization training. Change the locations. Change the discriminative stimuli, the people who are watching them and assessing them. Increase the difficulty. Find many different ways to run possible scenarios. And that the more they do this in more different situations with different people present, the more likely you are to get the behavior when you finally go out to test it in the actual situation, in the actual environment, in situ. All right, so that's it for behavior skills, and we'll see you for the next lecture. Have a good day.